Hello, Mimi. I'm so glad to have you here today. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you. And you have just an incredible background from Open Web Collective to SHE-256, but also this background in working at Near Protocol, which for those people who don't know is a big layer one blockchain, and then KKR, which is a much more traditional TradFi space. And I can't wait to dive into what that looked like of being an analyst there in traditional finance and then moving into this world of the open web or Web3 or blockchain or whatever you want to call it. So I can't wait to dive in. I'd love if you could just share a bit of where you're calling in from and what you're focused on these days.
Absolutely. So I'm calling in from Miami, sunny, warm Miami right now in March, and I'm very thankful for that. The weather hasn't been too nice previously, and I know it's pretty rough in other areas right now. So I'm the founder and managing partner of Open Web Collective, or OWC Ventures. You hit the nail on the head. We are a Web3 venture firm focused on disruptive technology. So that goes well across blockchain, AI, really emerging tech, right? I think often when we talk about Web3, we can kind of silo it to just blockchain, and folks don't realize we actually have to pop open a bit more to really understand. It's really bringing together a few key terms that we know of, right? So IoTs, maybe that's AI, that's blockchain. And so at our firm, we're really excited about the full gamut of what it means to bring Web3 to life and the numerous amount of technologies that really takes to do that. And so what's really cool and what I love about our name is, we're not just focused on bringing in the next version of the web, but it's a very specific characteristic we want of it. We want it to be open. And so we're a venture firm that launched in 2020. We're focused on sort of pre-seed to Series A, alongside doing the stuff that we do in venture and blockchain. We also run an accelerator program, which is where, some of the things that you started to mention of, operator side gets back into things with me. And so I always just enjoy and love spending time with our earliest pre-seed founders as well. So I do a myriad of things, as you can imagine, but it's always fun being at sort of the edge.
I love that. It is fun to be at the edge, and it's also challenging. It has its pros and cons. So I can't wait to dive into that with you. And thanks for explaining some of those nuances, right? Because I think we just hear this catch-all phrase of Web3, and there's some really interesting things we can dive into there. But first, I always ask this question because it's such an equalizer, and I feel like anyone listening, we all start from somewhere. Do you remember what your first ever investment was? What got you started?
Yeah, it's a great question because when I think back to it, and what I love about this question is that it's so layered, right? You can sort of think about it probably from the first time you probably got your birthday money and you held on to, and you were like, where am I going to put this cash? To all the way when you started your career and you're like, all right, I'm on my first big deal. Like, oh my gosh. And so when I sort of think about both, sort of just like being very just like junior and being able to like, save my own cash and think about where to put it, it's really the decisions that, my parents allowed me to even decide just where to like store my money, right? Like I got to go into Bank of America, I got to go into Citizens, they sat me down, right? And I was able to sort of hear and felt very professional, like, oh, great, I get to hear that the savings is like 0.1 interest. And it was just still such an experience for me to be like, oh, okay, great. And, it was one of those things where like, even where to put my money was a conversation I got to have, right? And so I think while it's not investing, it really is, something I'd love to get into in this conversation of that's a part of the financial literacy journey, right? I think we often skip to investing, but don't start at the basics of what financial literacy is. And that's actually just managing of money, right? Like the money you earn today, how do you steward it? And so I sort of think back to that and then thinking about, my first Web3 deal, which was covalence, right? So I was thinking about sort of data and APIs and blockchain querying. And so the full gamut is applicable when we think about sort of our financial journey, right? I don't want to sort of ever separate it or silo it to investing or managing because both are sort of the evolution of how we sort of come into things as individuals.
Oh, I love that perspective so much. And I love this question because it really does span the spectrum. Like people may think of investing in community, wealth can mean so much more than money and investments. It can mean relationships, energy, time, however you're like stewarding, which is also a great word, the resources that you have in your life that you have access to. And so how and why did you get into your space? And maybe you could share a little bit about like what KKR is, what you were doing there,
Yes.
and then how you shifted into this new emerging landscape, which is a whole wild, wild west.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll sort of just start that I've always married the hybrid between tech and finance, and it's always been a fun place for me to play at. And so early in my career, I, majored in finance and sort of a dual major in poli sci. And so I feel like today it maybe comes all together because blockchain is sort of like, sociological principles with tech, and then the investing comes back in. So I
Yeah.
feel like it worked out, right, in terms of degree in some way, but I've always sort of married tech and finance and started my career very fortunate in private equity, so focused on tech, and then sort of moved into various areas within sort of private equity with, capital raising across different asset classes. And really, after sort of doing the TradFi scene, I knew I wanted to be in tech fully, right? Like I knew it wasn't sort of a woman's dominated space. I knew it was, all engineers, and that was sort of the big focus. But I wanted to spend time there. I'd been doing some stuff, tinkering with code on the side. I didn't really know how it fit in perfectly, right? Because I just wasn't the traditional architect. No one was in Silicon Valley saying like, "Hey, I want to find a PE person to be an operator," right? Like it just wasn't the profile, right? Everyone wanted other founders, other engineers. And I was just very fortunate again to, Ilya Polisuk and Alex Gadanov, early team members, to join and be an early team member of Near. And, those two guys were fantastic. I mean, Alex Gadanov, again, his background is in, early team member of MemSQL, so distributed databases. Ilya Polisuk, he was an author of TensorFlow, so core piece of AI for Google. So it just sort of lets you know the caliber of engineers I was joining so early on. And so it was a no-brainer when they had told me about their vision to build this blockchain network, the whole principles behind it, their explorations with AI, then move into blockchain and why it was needed. I was like, sign me up. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not that good at coding, but I'm going to do it. I did everything. And that's really what's the most fascinating parts about early startup. And then, from that experience being a operator, helping build, and then also lead investments for Near, settling back into what I do, which is now more earlier stage investing at, like I said before, sort of the full spectrum of Web3. So it's really been a full circle to start at sort of larger stage PE to all the way now to early stage pre-seed, right? Full circle. Yeah.
Really, like you have done the spectrum. Few follow-up questions on what you just shared. First is for those people who don't know, there's so much terminology that can be overwhelming. Can you just give a quick one-liner of what is private equity? What do you actually do in private equity?
Yeah, I think this is great because when I started to talk about it with this sort of full spectrum of how you can invest in companies, folks often understand that venture capital probably plays in the sort of earliest stages to sort of mid growth stage. And then you sort of get into these, what we call growth stage firms, equity firms, where it's much larger. These are large companies. And private equity, really, in its name, is about sort of private companies and deals that we're investing in at a much more mature stage. Sometimes these can look like we're buying it from family owned, right? It could be generations of families who have owned this probably like infrastructure company. Sometimes it can be we're actually buying it probably like there's times where we were doing deals, and I want to make sure I keep things privy, but large fashion brands. I mean, folks don't understand this, but I think there was a great stat that was like, more than 50% of consumer companies are actually owned by private equity. It's just a portfolio of private equity at the end of the day, right? And so I think what's really interesting about that sort of side of things is that it's not equities, it's not public, and it's not as early stage. So you do have a lot more meat to look at, a lot more to assess, and these deals, of course, are usually done in a more closed private nature than sort of what we often hear of sort of like venture capital that's always being announced. Equities, how everything's moving quickly, right? They're private deals that are much larger and much more mature, and they can range from large, corporate deals to all the way to family-owned companies that we're buying out.
I love that. Thank you. It's so important to share for, we have such a broad audience, and it's really nice to be able to dive in really simple terms of like what these things are, what they mean. And the other thing I would ask is just a little bit more backstory of like, how did you get even in front of this opportunity of the early founding team of Near? How did you meet those people and those players?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of the most important things in your journey is networking, meeting folks, and just being where you're excited. And so I think, early on when I had moved from New York to San Francisco, I knew I wanted to be in tech. I just didn't quite know where just yet. And so placing myself, in places where I can meet more founders, more folks that were at the edge of conversations really allowed for sort of a network to grow, right? I was really curious. And I think this is for anyone who's interested in anything. It's not just sort of about the online Google research, the metaverse that we can do. It's actually the in person, right? Grabbing coffee with people, trying to assess for yourself personally where you're most excited. And so, the sort of introduction to Near really came through Alex. Sasha or Alex at Near, who was really the first person that I connected with and is head of BD there and brought me in and was excited about bringing more women and a diverse background. And so he just got me instantaneously and got my ethos. And that's really what brought me along. So I would say also kudos to him because I think it wasn't sort of a direct, clear, like there was a fit for me, but he sort of understood how I played a part in the larger vision.
I love that. And did you just meet him socially or like did you reach out to him?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we met socially. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I think it's so nice to go to the root of is a lot of people are like, sometimes it just happens really naturally. It's not like any sort of effort. It's sometimes people just the places, spaces that you find yourself in or you put yourself in actually unlock like the next step. And I think sometimes people get overloaded with like job applications and feeling like lost in the noise of the metaverse, to your point, and the power of just bringing yourself back to reality in the present and being in spaces around people you want to be around and knowing and trusting that will be the thing that propels you forward. So I love that so much. So now you're working in the early stage space. What role does that mean for you in the wealth space, in the wealth generation space? And why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely. So to sort of add color, when you are a founder or part of a venture capital firm, depending on sort of where you sit, the great thing about us, we're a small enough firm that, we touch everything. I think the two parts that really come to mind for me is, distributing capital and stewarding capital, right? That is two big things that I do on a daily, right? I think when we talk about stewarding capital is that folks are investing in us to invest in the strategies we see fit, right? The strategies that we're excited to push forward where we think capital should be, right? And then the second part is distributing capital, right? So now we have to make a decision as an investment manager, where should capital be placed to push forward this this vision that we see for the web, right? So if it's more open, if it's democratized, if it includes blockchain, if it includes digital assets, and both of those two parts, I think, as I come back to before where my first investments were, right? It's like, where to place my money? It's like, who should steward it, right? And then distributing it, right? So I've always sort of played a cycle in both parts of it. And so I still get to do that today in my role.
So awesome. And what do you think has been the most exciting thing that you would want people to know, especially around the open web? We started to touch on that really briefly, but like when you're thinking about the future, like where this is going to go, what lights you up that you feel like maybe other people don't really know yet or see yet?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I feel like there's probably some bits that everyone knows, and I probably want to stick sort of the basics and the high level. And I think, one thing that I often find when people are sort of skeptics or they don't believe in blockchain is there's no killer use case. That's like what I hear often. They're like, there's no killer use case. Blockchain is a technology just searching for a use case. And what I tend to tell people is like, wait, you've actually missed the obvious, right? Like DeFi is the use case and the killer application is digital assets. What we've actually done is created a computer protocol that can be generalized. And so it's often in sort of the narrative of how we push blockchain, it's like, we've had the killer use case from the beginning. We've had the killer app from the beginning. We've actually been spending time touring around to push it down, to say, how can it apply to consumers? How can it apply to IP? How can it apply to how we invest? How can we apply to how we relate to each other in the metaverse? And so I think that's just something that when I tell people that, they're like, oh, wow, like, I guess I'm not too much a skeptic of the technology and what's happening here. I'm like, yeah, we already have the use case. It's already been valued at $1 trillion, right? Digital assets, its full market cap. So we're making progress. And I think with like chat GPT and everything happening, you can get people who just want so much hype and noise and forget the reality of the progress that's actually being made in this space.
I really love that, especially, we're in a bear cycle. There's been a number of bad actors and things that are like imploding. And so it's so nice to anchor back on the reality. And I think that can happen even in our personal lives where we forget how much we've accomplished and we are always trying to think about the next thing and moving the
Yes.
goalposts. That's such a beautiful thing to remember. We've already created decentralized finance and driven a lot of value through that system and ideology, and there's just more to come, and it's very much in an early infancy of building all the applications and seeing it get, mass adoption. In that realm, is there a person or company in the space that's really inspiring you, building that future?
Yeah. So I want to say that what I think is, most exciting in general, so even zooming out of Web3 is the fact that I think probably when I started sort of general sort of coming to age, it just started being that like, fintech was everything, SaaS was everything, but we weren't getting to the concepts of like democratizing, right, was a priority, right? I feel like that's just come in the last like probably 10 or so, 15 years, where now folks are like, we want to democratize access. It's not just about easy banking, right? I felt like early on it was about like just creating neobanks because it was easier and people wanted to manage money more efficiently. And that was all the sort of ethos around fintech. Just in the last few years, we've started to double down on access to capital, democratization matters. And so I think there are so many players in Web2 and Web3 that are doing this really well, including you all, right? Who are a part of the conversation to how do we do two things, right? So I think what's great is Syndicate.io is a great example of someone who's doing that well and sort of allowing folks to invest in communities and groups. You have sort of like folks like Allocate and Velvet who are doing that at the private fund level. And then you have folks like you all who are sort of playing at the edges of neobanks, but very niche audiences, right? So you have neobanks that focus on sort of early adults. You have some of you who focus on early, children's like middle school, right? Like you've seen those sort of like neobank and credit cards for like middle schoolers so that they can graduate into financial literacy. And then what you all are doing with women, right? So I think what's really exciting right now is this group of or sort of class of tech companies that are pushing for democratization in so many verticals and instruments and asset classes within finance.
It's really amazing to kind of hear that perspective of how you're seeing the industry and the specific companies too that you mentioned that are democratizing access, which we will link in the transcript for everyone else who wants to dive in. When you think about the advice you would give to somebody, or maybe even like yourself, when you were making this transition into this emerging landscape, there's this saying that I love, which is like pioneers get arrows and settlers get land. Like, how do you set yourself up to be okay with maybe being on the edge of that pioneering? And especially people who might be listening to this who are in more the traditional roles, operators, technologists, investors, thinking about like, where is my space and place in this new world, especially with all the chaos, right, that is unfolding?
Absolutely. So I think I'll probably start off at the folks who you may not want to 100% go into Web3 and investing in it, but just in general, how do you sort of move up the financial literacy path and curve? And I think this is one that we should definitely bring up because I think I've said this before, financial literacy investing, they're two separate and we should think about them separate, but they go hand in hand, right? So, folks need to get the basics of financial literacy down. And I think in the US, once you get to college or whatever the coming of age is, it's important to make sure you have that down. When I talk about, financial literacy, it's again, managing your money, right? Like household budgeting, how are you doing those things? Understanding the trade-offs of debt and credit, right? Like a lot of times we sort of miss getting people to these basics and they're so important because if you don't know this, it's hard for me to convince you to come into Web3. Right? It's hard for me to tell you, spend time in Web3. It's hard for me to tell you, diversify your assets or invest. And so really that's the place where I want people to start is financial literacy. And then moving into investing, right? It's really about how do I allow my put my money to work, right? Put my capital to work. And so, once you get there, it's really a question of how, what, and why, right? Like, why are you getting into investing, right? Maybe your why is like, I'd like to put my money to places that matter to me, women, people of color. Maybe it's eco-friendly things. Maybe it's thinking about like ESG principles, or maybe you say, I just need diversification and I like risk, right? Like that might be your why. Then it's sort of going down to the how will you do it? Some folks are excited to, be more hands-on with their money. So you're going to go to an Eve platform and you want to manage your money actively, or go to a Robinhood. Some folks are like, I don't want to touch my money at all, right? Like, I just want to give it to someone, an investment manager, and that's how I feel best it's going to operate. I'm going to pay someone to manage it. And then sort of the what becomes like venture capital, individual funds, startups, ETFs, right? And that's how it sort of builds on. So for anyone, my advice is start at the basics. If you're not at like the financial literacy part where you're saving, you've got your budget down, I wouldn't encourage to move forward, right? Like, I want you to be strong there and then move into investing. Now, if you're someone, you've got all of that down, you've been playing, you've been finicking for a while, then, I think the first step to diving into Web3 is absolutely just get your hands in it. Join a Discord, join a DAO, join something. Like, you don't need to know anything at all, just like what we said at the beginning. Just go in the spaces where people are talking, where things are happening. And I think it's the best way you'll start to get it as an investor. Yeah, my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and I would love, just as we kind of conclude, to know what else you'd love to share, if anything, and most importantly, how we can follow you and your journey as an investor and as a leader in the space, as well as open web.
Yeah, absolutely. So as most in the space, I have a Twitter. So if you'd like to follow me, Mimi at OWC. But more specifically for our founders out there, if you're building anything in Web3 and you're early in pre-seed, apply to our accelerator program. The application's on the website. For those who are later stage, shoot us a message at OWC Founders. Like I said, we do everything from C to, Series A and a little bit up. For community, other investors, always excited to connect. And so our newsletter is also another good way, and our website will give you a link to that.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mimi. I will definitely be following along, and I hope you listening will too. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.